Thank you for joining me today for the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation Holocaust Education Center podcast series. This episode is generously sponsored by Elena and Larry Canfer. I am joined today by Dr. Sharon Shavitt, Professor Emerita of Business Administration at the Geis College of Business at the University of Illinois and the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. Thank you for joining me today, Sharon.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about yourself. You're semi-retired from the Geis College of Business. What are you teaching there right now?
Yeah, I retired just last year, but it's sort of retired in quotes because I still teach a course there every year and still do my research. But my main focus in teaching was around consumer behavior and especially global issues in consumer behavior. And that's what the courses that I co-teach is on global branding, how to build successful brands around the world.
Obviously, professionally, you were here in Champaign-Urbana, but where were you raised?
Oh, that's a great question because it's not a short answer. All over. I was born in Boston. My dad was a professor of chemistry and he was doing a visiting stint at Brandeis at that time. And then he moved to Columbia and IBM labs in New York. So I lived in New York a couple of years. And at age 3, we went to Israel, where my parents were from, where they had met and married, but I had not been. So that was my first time. And I kind of grew up partly there in Haifa for about 5 years. And then we moved back to the States to, of all places, Columbus, Ohio. And I grew up in Columbus from age 8 onward. I went to Ohio State for college and also for graduate school. And then after getting my PhD there in social psychology, I worked for a couple of years at Indiana University on a postdoctoral fellowship before coming to Illinois, where I've spent really my whole career.
I need to point out at this point that you're the only person who's ever graduated from Ohio State that didn't start with the Ohio State. Is that not mandatory?
You almost have to sign a form when you graduate from there that you'll use the definite article.
And how did you get involved with CUJF? What is your involvement with the Jewish community in Champaign-Urbana?
Well, we've been members of the temple for many, many years, and we've been donors to CUJF and sometimes go to events. That's been our involvement, and it's always been important to us.
Well, I appreciate you being here today and telling your story, your mother's story. My question for you, if you remember roughly how old you were or what part of your life were you told that your mother was a survivor?
I don't remember not knowing that she was a survivor. It was such a part of our conversations. I couldn't even give you an age. From 3 on, when we were in Israel, I was in fact surrounded by survivors. Lots of people there were refugees of the war. I remember that a great aunt once came to visit us from Hungary. I was probably about 6. I vividly remember seeing her tattoo on her arm that she had been in Auschwitz and somehow survived, which was not the case for a number of her siblings. It was a very, I don't want to say normal, but like typical thing that you would be around survivors all the time. So I knew from a very young age. And I grew up with many, many stories of near misses and sheer luck, all the things that could have happened but didn't happen that brought them to the point that they were, which is alive and thriving and building their own family.
Let's walk through your mother's story. She was born and raised in Budapest. In her own words, she says, quote, "What it took to survive the Holocaust was a little intelligence, lots of courage, and mainly luck." Can you please walk me through what happened to her, where this started?
She would often tell me stories of sort of the gathering storm, the fact that people knew for a long time. So Hungary wasn't occupied by the Nazis until 1944. Of course, the war started in 1939. So there was a long period where people were just kind of living with this hanging over their heads, knowing that it was coming. And for a long time, there were what they called Jewish laws that became increasingly severe and draconian. And that of course, was amped up in a major way once the Nazis actually came in and took power in 1944. But they were there basically approximately the last year of the war. And in that time, they managed to kill hundreds of thousands of people. But up until that time, people were forced into different kinds of housing, moving to like a Jewish quarter. Before that, my grandfather, who worked as an insurance agent and had a non-Jewish partner or person he worked with, he was seeing these storm clouds gathering and trying to get a visa to get his family out of the country. But of course, it was very difficult. There were Jewish quotas. The quota for Hungarians was very small. So it was a long wait. He eventually lost his job as these laws became more and more restrictive, and it wasn't legal for him to work in this profession. And so he had to find other work. Everyone was doing what they could, scrambling to adjust to every new worsening of the situation that just kept happening, kind of like a drumbeat, until the actual occupation happened, and when things got so much worse. But I guess to illustrate what you said in that quote of luck and courage, and mainly luck, Mom tells a story in 1944. They had been moved to a Jewish house. They had lived in a very nice apartment in a nice area of Budapest, a block from the Danube River. And it's a lovely apartment. She's described it to me a million times, with a balcony that wrapped around the corner of the building and 3 large rooms. And it was filled with art. Of course, all that was lost in the war. But before the occupation, they had to move to a Jewish house. People were concentrated into more or less a Jewish ghetto. In 44, under occupation, Jews could only leave the house for maybe a couple hours at a time, just to buy food and necessities. That was it. And they had to wear the yellow star everywhere, of course, right? So one day she says she came back from shopping, and she's kind of rounding the corner, and she sees her building, and she sees groups of residents being taken out of the building, like soldiers or people like that, rounding up the people in the building and taking them in a group. And immediately, like, she knows she does not want to go any closer. And she was holding a bag. She describes to me that she had this purse, and in those days, these handbags were like envelopes. So she put it right up against her chest to cover the yellow star. And she took the yellow star out surreptitiously behind the bag, and she immediately went to her aunt's house.
She knew.
Yeah, she knew she could not allow herself to be rounded up with that group. What I don't know is how her mother and her sister managed not to be rounded up. There are parts of these stories that just kind of get a little bit foggy. But she went to her aunt's. Her aunt's name was Muncie, her father's sister. This aunt married a Catholic man. And when things became dangerous, she converted to Catholicism, thinking it would be safer because it might buy some time, but it really didn't buy much. The aunt said, "You can stay here for one night, but just one night, not more," because she didn't want to blow their cover or, endanger herself either. Mom says that some boy maybe brought her some clothes because she'd left with only what she was wearing. And so then she went, and somehow, I think she got connected up with Jewish resistance people and got forged documents so that she could live under an assumed name and an assumed identity.
Forged visas, or everyone had papers?
Everyone had papers. So I can tell you that story, but what I was trying to say with the story of how she saw people being rounded up is that this was 99% luck. That she got lucky, that she didn't get back a few minutes earlier, right? That was the huge piece of it. But there was also the courage and smarts piece of it, that she had to see that she had gotten extremely lucky, and she had to grab that and use that. In story after story that she told me, that was really the theme. Some people tried really hard and were unlucky, and it was random. And some people got lucky, but maybe didn't realize it or leverage it. And what she felt was important is that when opportunities like that happened, she would grab them and try to use that, and got lucky that it actually worked. So in terms of her false papers, this is one of the stories, it's the most vivid one that I had growing up. So I mentioned that my grandfather was an insurance agent, and the man he worked with was not a Jew. But he was a kind man who understood the pressure and the danger that his coworker was under and that his family was in. So one day he said to him, "I have a daughter." He had a daughter who was exactly between my mom's age and her younger sister. My mom was 17 and this daughter was 16. My mom's sister, Eva, was 15. The man told my grandfather that, "I have these papers of my daughters here. I'm going to put them on the desk here. If something happens to them, well, there's nothing I can do about it." And in doing that, he probably took a big step towards saving my mom and my aunt's life. So now she had papers of a Gentile girl, and those papers included her baptismal certificate, which was extremely important, and her school ID and a photo and all of these kinds of things. That's one set of papers, but there was my mom and her sister. So my mom said that she remembers just staying up, lying awake for hours, trying to figure out how could she make this work? How could she alter the papers or get help with forging or do what did she need to do to make this save both of them? And she said, you got 3 copies of papers. You had to always give 1 copy to the police. You had to give 1 to what was called the Hausmeister, the house master, and 1 you carried around. And she said that she had to be very careful with her sister Eva, who was 15, because she was someone who would not necessarily be thinking all the time about safety. She kind of took risks, unnecessary risks. She would chat with soldiers when she really should have kept her head down, that kind of thing. And she was sort of dramatic. So mom was afraid of giving her false identity with a false name. If I remember right, she was afraid that the girl's name, which was Maria Ritz like the cracker. She said Maria Ritz was not a common name, and she was afraid that if she and Ava had that same name in that same age group, someone would notice. So she was thinking what to do, and she decided that the copy that goes to the police, she would alter to Maria Pitts with a P. And that way, the copy that she gave to the Hausmeister and that she would carry around, she just had to add a small line to the P to make Ritz. She made other alterations too, all kinds of little things. She added a letter to the first name of the mother. The mother was Alma, and she made it into Salma and things like that. So she said she just made it different enough that it might ring alarm bells. And in this way, she managed to get 2 copies of not exactly the same identity, but similar. And my mom and my aunt lived in hiding with those same documents as that girl.
So at that age, they should have been in school, but instead they spent their days and their nights, their whole existence hiding.
My mom had been in school. I mean, they both had been, of course, before the war started. My mom was in a Catholic school at that time. And when the Nazis came, mom went to the nuns who had been her teachers and asked them, please, to hide her. But they declined. They offered they would pray for her soul.
One of the stories that your mom told in her first-person account was about her walking back to her desk in the Catholic school, touching somebody's desk. Can you retell that story a little bit?
I heard this story too, and the way that I remember it is that when she would brush against somebody's desk, they would take out some cleaning fluid, like immediately clean off the desk and buff it, as if she had contaminated it somehow with her presence. She was a dirty Jew.
Your mom and her sister are now in hiding. Then what happened?
So they're in hiding for months, I think, at that point. Their father had already been killed. He was the after effects of a forced labor camp that men were rounded up and taken to. At age 42, he was gone. So it was really up to them to figure out what to do. And after he lost his insurance job, he had a Gentile partner in an import-export business that they ran with Nicaragua. Kind of random, I know, but he was looking for any kind of opportunities, and they were very successful at it. So my grandfather made some money, and when the war really came to their doorstep, he gave the money to this partner of his and said, please hold on to it for my family. And my mom would sometimes contact him, this partner, to give her some money when she was in hiding so that she could continue to survive. There were people who helped, not a lot, but there were some, and they were taking a risk. So he would meet my mom on a street corner and give her some money. She had to do so many things. She described to me a time, I think this was very early on when she had the papers of Maria Ritz, and she needed a photo ID. She needed the school ID to have mom's picture on it, not this girl's picture on it. And she found her way through some Jewish resistance people to an underground forgery lab. And she described to me this enterprise that she saw going on, the clever ways that people found with very little equipment, but a lot of ingenuity to alter documents in whatever way needed to be done. She described to me a process where people would take a signature off of one document and put it onto another by rolling a hard-boiled egg over it. And apparently the outside edge of a peeled egg, the ink would adhere to it just enough that they could then roll it over another document. At least this is what my mom witnessed and described to me. But that was the only way that she could get an ID with her picture on it, and it worked.
So she has papers now with her proper ID. She and her sister are middle to late teens.
And they're hiding on opposite sides of the Danube. The city of Budapest is spread across the left and right bank, and one side is Buda and one side is Pest. My aunt was hiding on one side, and they would meet on the street so that they could make sure that each of them was okay. But it was a very dangerous thing to do, extremely, because if they were stopped and asked for papers, well, they were the same person. In fact, there was a time when someone stopped them. There were two soldiers or guard, whoever they were, police. Mom has her back to Eva and she hands her document to one policeman. Eva hands her document to the other policeman. They don't compare them. This was one of those near misses.
They're on opposite sides of the Danube. Who helped them? Who liberated them? How did they get out and how did they get reunited?
They didn't really need to be liberated so much as once the war ended, and it ended with the Allied bombing of Budapest, and the Russians came in, the Soviet army, and the Nazis retreated. So they left their hiding places. My mom tells a story of meeting up with my grandmother, who was working in one of Raoul Wallenberg's Swedish Red Cross hospital. My grandmother was basically being a nurse in his hospital so that she could be safe. And then she left that and they met up somewhere, I'm not sure where, but part of the story that I remember is that my aunt, during the bombardment, the Allied bombardment, actually crawled across one of the bridges across the Danube and down the street and made it to, I guess, their apartment at that time, and just suddenly showed up like a ghost as the bombs were falling. Yeah, it's very cinematic in my mom's retelling, but I'm sure it's true.
Your mom and your aunt are reunited with their mother at this point. They obviously, at some point, left Hungary. So how did that happen?
My mom left 1946. She did not want to stay in Hungary. Once the war ended, she had too many memories of people who collaborated. Just because the Nazis were gone didn't mean the Nazis were gone. She had been lying awake nights before the Nazis marched in, listening to the Hungarian fascist party, the people who were running Hungary then, rounding up Jews and shooting them into the Danube. She heard this. She lived a block from the Danube. She'd seen all the different ways that people helped. She describes going to Miskolc, which is a smaller town where the family was originally from, and some of her relatives, my grandmother's relatives, lived. She describes going there after the war and noticing that the people there in Miskolc seemed afraid of her. Why? Because she thinks that they thought she would tell the Russian soldiers that they had collaborated. So they didn't trust her. They feared her. The Russians were looking for collaborators.
Where did she then settle after that?
She left Hungary with the help of one of the Jewish agencies that basically smuggled her out. People didn't have normal visas to get out. She just wanted out. She didn't want to stay in Hungary with those people who had killed her family, many members of her family. She made it out. She describes the night that she was picked up along with other young people and loaded onto the back of a flatbed truck that then had tires stacked on top of them. So the truck that was going across the border was like it was carrying cargo tires. And she describes how they had to lay still and everything. And at the border crossing to Austria, the Russian guard had a sense that something wasn't right, and he wanted to be paid off. And so he reached down between the tires and he actually pulled her hair. And then he was sort of making the point that, I know this is not just tires you've got here. He wanted to make sure that it wasn't contraband that they were sneaking out, just humans. And he was paid off and the truck continued.
So they got across the border to Austria.
So she's across the border in Austria, and she describes not feeling safe, not feeling free until she made it to the American sector of Vienna, as Vienna was divided up. And once she was in the American zone, she felt she had escaped, fully free. At that point, the difficulty was finding work, doing something to keep yourself alive, but at least it wasn't that you were being hunted. It wasn't long after that. Actually, she spent not that much time in Vienna, but she spent some time in Salzburg. And there was a big displaced persons camp, DP camp there. And she didn't want to stay in the DP camp. And it turns out that the American forces that were administering it, they needed translators. And Mom spoke fluent English and German because her father had insisted that as a school child, as a young school child, she learn English because that was the language of the future, he was telling her, and he knew. So she walked into the office of the American commander, whoever it was who was administering this DP camp, and said, I speak English and German. And they said, oh, please sit down. And they wanted her immediately to go to work. And as a result, not only did she work for the American Armed Forces, but she had the lodging of staff for the armed forces, and she had the rations that they got. Everything was a lot better. So she did that for a while. She also worked with Jewish agencies like the AJDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, and HIAS, all kinds of ways now being kind of scrappy and inventive to get yourself to be able to have a decent life. She also was in Stuttgart, Germany, and she was hoping to be able to get a visa to the US, but the quotas were still in place. It was going to be an 8-year wait for a visa. And so in 1949, she made Aliyah to Israel, sailing across the Mediterranean from Marseille.
Was she welcome when she got there?
Oh, yes. People were very welcome when they got there. This was now after the War of Independence, so Israel was a state. And then her stories are about jobs that she had and things that she did when she first arrived in Israel.
What about her sister and her mother? What ended up happening to the rest of your family?
After a while, my mom wrote to her mother saying, it's not life without your mom. You know, I really want you to come. And so my grandmother came. My aunt, by that point, had a little boy. She had a baby. His name is Micha. My grandmother brought Micha on a boat to Israel. And my mom describes vividly meeting her in Haifa at the port and seeing her mother get off the boat and seeing her carrying a toddler. And she had no idea that my grandmother was bringing Micha. The plan was that my aunt would come on the next boat. She would be coming very shortly. But what happened was not that. Instead, my aunt was trapped in communist Hungary because Khrushchev closed the borders. So that boat that my grandmother took with Micha was one of the last, if not the last, people being able to get out. So my aunt was trapped in Hungary for 4 years. She didn't see her child for 4 years. My aunt had a very interesting life. She never told us who helped her, but she was smuggled out by a diplomat who was apparently pretty high up and who we think was British. So he helped her for whatever reason, and she came out in the trunk of a car.
Her ordeal didn't end with the liberation. When they got to Israel, were they able to breathe a sigh of relief? Were they able to live a somewhat normal life after that?
Yes, they definitely lived a normal life in Israel, even though there was drama in Israel, right? In the 50s and 60s and 70s, I mean, there were wars, but it was not the same stress as occupied Hungary, whether it was occupied by the Nazis or by the Soviets.
By telling your mother and your aunt and your grandmother's story now, what do you hope people get out of this story?
That's a great question. I would like people to understand how challenging it was, how awful it was, how it permeated every aspect of your life if you survived or you didn't. I know there's so much anti-Semitism in the world always, but it's really flared up recently, the last few years. And I guess I would like people to understand that this has always been happening. It's not called the oldest hatred for nothing. Anti-Semitism is a shapeshifter. It's something that always has a new form in each generation, but it's always there. And so I think we have different forms of it in our society today. I would want people to understand more about the Holocaust, how it happened, how it was allowed to happen. I want them to understand that it didn't happen only because a lot of Nazis forced their will on many people. It could only happen with the help and support and collaboration of many, many people. My father's family was from Poland. My father's father, left Poland and made Aliyah in the 1920s, saying there was no future there. No one in the family who stayed behind survived. And that wasn't only because the Nazis were who they were. It happened with a lot of help. One has choices when horrible things are happening to other people. One can be a help or one can do nothing. And that's a help to the other side.
I have one more question before I let you go. Your mother says this of what it feels like to have American Jews talk about being Jewish, what it means to them. Quote, "I feel like I have graduated while the others are still going to school," end quote. What would you like modern Jews to take from this statement and from her story?
I think she was expressing that being Jewish is a multi-layered thing. Even if you don't go to temple, you're still considered a Jew by other Jews and by the rest of society, for good or for ill. My family was not particularly religious, but it didn't matter. In fact, at one point, my mother converted, I'm using quotation marks here, converted. I think she was a Lutheran at one point. The idea was that if you converted, you would be spared, but it didn't spare anybody. That was a Band-Aid. It worked for a short period, and then it went back to, well, if you were born a Jew, you're a Jew. If you have one grandparent who's a Jew, you're a Jew, and so on. We share a common fate, whether we want to accept that or not.
Now that you know your mother's life story and you knew her as well as you did, would you say that intelligence, courage, or luck helped her survive, or a combination of the three?
Definitely a combination of the three. Luck was indispensable, but she's very courageous. She's a fighter. I mean, she always has been. And if she sees an injustice or something that is being asked of her that she thinks is wrong or shouldn't be done or isn't wise, she'd be the first to say, no, we're not doing that. We're doing this instead. She's very scrappy. And I think that too was instrumental. She couldn't have survived without being both lucky and very courageous, very inventive.
Thank you for listening to the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation Holocaust Education Center podcast series. Dr. Sharon Shavitt, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.